Many knitters love to use variegated yarns and just let them do their thing with all that flashing and pooling and striping, but sometimes you just don't want that in your hand knits. So what can you do? There's actually quite a bit you can do with those variegated yarns. We're going to explore some patterns in this video and what makes them good to use with variegated yarns to bring out those best attributes in those yarns and avoid any potential pooling or flashing. Hey nerdy knitter, Tanya here. I'm a certified knitting instructor and a master hand knitter, and I believe that knitting can be a form of self-care. You can take time for yourself and your creative hobbies and still create beautiful garments that you love to wear. In this video, it's all about variegated yarns, actually a series of videos. I'm going to link to a playlist with some more videos specifically on this topic where we dive deep into the topic of variegated yarn. In this video specifically, we're going to explore different knitting patterns themselves and what about those patterns makes them suitable for knitting with variegated yarn. Now, I asked about your pattern recommendations and a lot of people said that they just love to knit plain stockinette projects and let that variegated yarn do its thing, whether that's flashing or pooling or striping, they just let it happen. And that's totally fine, totally valid. But a lot of the times you don't want that to happen every single time. Maybe it's fun in a pair of socks, might not enjoy it so much in a cardigan or a sweater. So what can you look for in a knitting pattern that will help you avoid potential striping, micro striping, pooling, or flashing? And what should you look for in a project so you can get the best use of that variegated yarn? But before we get to that, I wanted to highlight two comments. In our last video on variegated yarn, which I'll link down below so you can watch that if you haven't watched it yet, we talked about a lot of things like the terminology behind like the striping and the flashing and the pooling and where variegated yarn fits within the hierarchy of hand-dyed yarns, and a quick run through of like different stitch patterns you can look for. There were lots of great comments shared as well. And it's worth going to watch the video just to go read the comments because just really good tips there. But I wanted to highlight two of them. This first one's about using the Ravelry search feature. When you're in Ravelry and you search for the yarn, there's an option to select specific colorways. Then you can filter by the type of project you're making, and that saves a lot of scrolling time. So in that last video, we went to Ravelry and used that feature to like look at a specific yarn and scroll through the projects other people had done to get an idea of how that yarn would look knit in different projects. This is taking it one step further and actually drilling down and looking at a specific colorway and a specific pattern. So if you know you have a very specific, like let's say you're knitting with Knit Picks static yarn, which is a self-patterning, you know you want to knit socks. So you can go look at the other patterns that are specifically using that colorway. Like I think the one I just used recently was called the Max. So I could look up that colorway and then look specifically for other socks and then see how those socks look, the other projects that other knitters have done. So that we did this on a higher level, just looking at the particular yarns, but this is drilling down, and I think that is a really fabulous way to use that Ravelry feature. Of course, it's going to be harder with like yarns that maybe are not as popular. There's going to be more projects in like very popular yarns, of course, but still very great tip. Now, the second comment I want to highlight is about using Yarn Sub, and I was surprised. I did not know this was there. I've used Yarn Sub a lot to actually look at yarn substitution, but there's other articles and helpful resources there as well. Like Kitten Corleone points out, the Yarn Sub site has an interesting feature that explores the colors of a skein and how it can work up depending on stitch counts per inch. It also shows how colors can vary whether projects are knitted in the round or a flat panel. Look in Techniques, scroll down to capturing the colors of a skein. It's fun to check out. It's more educational rather than practical. And it is really a good thing to look at if you have, it just uses one yarn in particular, but you can see from the example how the yarn combination, like what happens with that yarn changes depending on whether you're knitting flat or in the round and how many stitches are in that project. And the author of the page also shares how she was able to figure out how many stitches she could use to get the colors to line up in these vertical stripes. So it's very interesting to read. I'm going to put a link down below so you can check that out and play with the stitch count bar yourself because it's very interesting. We're going to look at 15 specific knitting patterns and what makes them a good choice for using with a variegated yarn. But before we do, I want to run through a list of like potential stitch patterns that you can look for when you are searching for projects to use with your variegated yarn. So you're not limited to just these 15 patterns. They're there as examples to get your brain working so you can think about looking for different patterns that would also work as well. Now, the first thing I like to look for is simple texture, not stockinette stitch. That's like no texture. That is smooth and flat. That's going to show every bit of striping or flashing or pooling with your project. And if we want to avoid that, we want to avoid stockinette stitch. What we want to look for is some simple texture like seed stitch, reverse stockinette stitch, garter stitch, all of those. Very simple texture, but the texture is there it can break up any of that variegated yarn flashing or pooling, potentially. It can just, that addition of texture can help break that up. Projects that slip stitches are another good choice because you are elongating that stitch and that's sort of making that one specific stitch longer than those around it, and that can make the color change as well. And then when you're slipping stitches, sometimes you carry the yarn in the back, sometimes you carry it in the front, so that can affect what's happening with those colors as well. If you're stranding yarn across the front of that project, then different colors are working and moving together in different ways. Along with that, we have cables. Now, I don't mean like full-on cables. Those are probably going to get lost in your variegated yarn. But slip stitch cables, because you are slipping stitches, and then when you are doing sort of a cable with them, you're elongating those stitches, and then you're also making them move back and forth across the fabric, which changes the location of some of those colors and can give you a more interesting effect and potentially avoid flashing and pooling. And look for projects that use a lot of increases and decreases to create movements, like feather and fan or old shale or chevron shaping, anything like that where there's lots of increases and decreases to make the fabric move in different directions. Those can work really well with variegated yarns. You can also pair that variegated yarn with a solid yarn. You could do stripes with the solid color and the variegated color. You can do helical knitting, which I forgot to mention in the last video, but quite a few of you mentioned that, so I'm going to pop a few comments here. But definitely a good way to add some change to that variegated yarn. Helical knitting is where you do one round with one color and then one round with another yarn. So you could do one round with your variegated and another with your complementary color. Or if you have two skeins of variegated yarn, whether it's the same or two different ones, you could do one round of each. Or if you just have the one skein, you could use either end of that skein to do the same thing as well. So that can break things up. It'll break up those colors more, so they'll be less likely to sort of pool together. There's also mosaic knitting, which uses two colors. So you could use a solid color and the variegated yarn. There is two color slip stitch knitting, which is technically not the same as mosaic. Mosaic would fit under slip stitch, but there are other slip stitch patterns that you could use holding the yarn in the front or the back or elongating stitches and using two colors. So that can break up those colors as well. And then there's also two color brioche, which is kind of technically a slip stitch pattern as well. And two color brioche is a fabulous way to use variegated yarns. I like it mixed with garter stitch. There's quite a few projects that you can find like that. So you get the texture of garter stitch, you get the texture of brioche, the two color brioche, and combined, it's a really good way to use a variegated yarn. Now, of course, there's other things we could use, but we should get to our patterns. We've got 15 of them to look at, and we'll explore the patterns, share a little bit of information about them, and then why they're good for variegated yarns. Now, it's going to be different depending on what type of variegated yarn you're using. There's some that are more muted. There's some that, have so many bright, bold colors, some with some speckles, and it's going to change depending on the yarn. But we'll just sort of get your ideas churning around in your head so you can get an idea of what you can look for in patterns to use with the variegated yarns that you have. Let's start with socks. Of course, you can knit plain vanilla socks and that variegated yarn is going to do its thing. But if you want to break that up a little, then we're going to look at a few sock patterns that will help you do that. First is Hermione's Everyday Socks by Erica Lueder. Now, this pattern, very, very simple, and it's just simple texture. If you look at the sock, you can see it just has some texture. It's just knit and purl, but that addition of some texture can break up the variegated yarn. And it's a variegated yarn that's used in this sock. And you can see how that variegation is broken up by the combination of knits and purl. So you get some of these purl bumps on the front of the fabric, and that can change the look of that yarn. Now, of course, you can really see the texture here as well in this plain knit pair, but there's another variegated, and you can still see some slight striping. That pink and the brown there, it looks like we're getting some sort of subtle striping, but the texture is breaking that up a little bit. Lots of striping here as well. You can still see some striping, but again, texture can help break that up. But this is what happens with a lot of variegated yarns in socks. Because it's such a small circumference, you're probably going to get some sort of striping effect, and that's hard to avoid, really. And let's not forget the pattern details. The pattern is free, uses fingering weight yarn, and the size range is just one size. But if you're used to knitting socks, then I'm thinking that the texture is simple enough that you could adjust the stitch count for the stitch count you like to use for your socks. Now, when I went scrolling through, I was looking for some different patterns, something that would be a little bit different, and this fit the bill. Dancing Pink Pumpkins by KnitJoyz. Now, this one changes the stitch pattern when the color changes. So if you look at the sock, we've got stockinette, sort of a very wide rib background, but then there is this sort of slip stitch decorative pattern used with one of the other colors. So this one is like basically a 2-color variegation. You can see there's other colors in there, but we have brown as our background color, and then there is this orange color. So the brown is used as that stockinette rib, and then when the orange is there, they switch to this sort of slip stitch decorative pattern. So that's a good way to use a variegated yarn. It's very popular. We're going to look at a few more patterns like this as well. So this pattern comes in 3 different sizes, fingering weight yarn, of course, for socks, and it's just under €4. There's another one that you can see there's some striping in here as well with this one, but it's a neat way to use a variegated yarn is to sort of pick one of the colors and use a different stitch pattern for that color to break up the colors a little bit. So I like this pattern as well, Contrast Blast Socks by Stephen West. So you can see it's a slip stitch pattern. There's some texture in here. There's some garter stitch along with stockinette stitch. So if you combine 2 colors like this, you could use that orange, but then instead of like the cream, use a complementary variegated yarn, and pairing it with another yarn and doing all of these different stitch patterns is going to break up any potential pooling. And you can see lots of the texture that's used here. So I don't see any variegated yarns used for the socks here. Let's see if some of the other projects used some. Ooh, I like the yellow and the pink. That's very bright. Okay, so everybody likes their solids here. Oh, is that one variegated? Okay, they only used the pattern up here, but you can see how that variegation's broken up with the cream in that sock. And here in this pattern as well. Oh, those are really pretty. So this is another variegated yarn paired with, they've got this light brown coffee color, and then the variegated pink and white yarn, or leaning into speckles, I suppose. But I think you get an idea of when you pair them together with a solid, then you can get some interesting techniques going on there. So this pattern comes in 5 sizes and uses fingering weight yarn, of course, and is €7. One more sock pattern, the Heel Toe Do-Si-Do by Crazy Sock Lady Designs. Now this uses one of those stitch patterns I mentioned when you talk about movement, chevrons or old shale or feather and fan, where you've got lots of increases and decreases in one specific row, and that changes the direction. Like if you look closely, oh, it doesn't want to go in any further. But you can see the stitches, instead of straight up and down, these increases and decreases, the stitches are moving off this way. These stitches are moving off this way. And that movement can help break up that variegated yarn. You can see she uses them. She does stripes here with the chevrons, and there is a variegated yarn used in here. And I like, so that's another thing to do. Pair it with other colors. Use one variegated yarn. You could use multiple in here, I think, and still have a really lovely pair. That's a really nice one. I like that. So the movement of these socks is a good way to use your variegated yarn. So this one comes in 3 sizes, fingering weight yarn, because it's socks, and is $5 US. So let's look at shawls, another very popular thing to knit. So first is Mend by Dawn Barker, and she has quite a few different shawls. I think I have another one on my list here. But I like how with this one, you can see the texture here. It's stockinette stitch with one color. And then when it switches to the pink, she works in linen stitch. So it adds some texture to the shawl. So this is a top-down triangle shawl. You can see the texture in there. You still get sort of some striping in here, but the addition of that texture really makes it very interesting. I really like the look of this. So it's stockinette stitch with the other colors. Basically, there's different shades of brown and beige in here. And then when it gets to that pink, she switches to stockinette or linen stitch. So she has other patterns as well, where the whole point is to use some variegated yarn and use different stitch patterns to bring some interest to that design and break up any potential pooling or striping. Now this one is just one size, uses fingering weight yarn, and it's $8 US. So here's another of Dawn's patterns. This is the float pattern, and you can see what I mean, how I just think this is a fabulous. So the background color is that gray, and there's a little bit of variegation in there, more tonal yarn, and then we have these pops of pink. But instead of linen stitch this time, we have this slip stitch, this cluster stitch that she uses in there. So I feel like this one is either a love or hate. Like you either think this is really cool and you like it, or you really dislike how variegated, I guess, it would look. But I just think it's another interesting way to use a variegated yarn where it looks like you would probably use a variegated yarn that has maybe just 2 or 3 colors, one that has like a lot of like one background sort of tonal color, and then you can add these interesting stitches with the other colors. So this is an asymmetrical triangle shawl, and it comes in one size, uses a fingering weight yarn, and it's also $8. This one's a recommendation from another knitter, The Simple Thing by Melina Brell. Very similar to the Sophie scarf, so if you are a fan of that, then it is sort of the same thing, just garter stitch, which is a great way to use variegated yarn, that texture. You can see here it's more of a tonal yarn, so garter stitch with an I-cord edge. Let's see if there's any projects in here that use, that's more of an ombre gradient. That's very pretty. Striping. So yes, you could even use this as a base and then do stripes with like a pair of variegated with a complementary solid color. So this one is free DK weight yarn, comes in the one size. Definitely a good choice for variegated yarn. Here's another recommendation, the City Lights Shawl by Under the Olive Tree. Now this one is interesting. It's a one skein knit, and you can see you've got over here, you're just letting that yarn do its thing, plain stockinette stitch. And then we have this sort of eyelet mesh on this side. And you can see how that changes some of that variegation. So if you want to do a combination of two, let that yarn do its thing and then pair it with a stitch pattern to see how that breaks up. It's a really interesting way to use a variegated yarn and see the best of both worlds to see how that yarn's going to look. So this is more of a crescent shawl shape. There's a more close-up look. So we've got that eyelet mesh here, and there's just the stockinette stitch. Very lovely variegated yarn used in the sample too. So this is one size, uses fingering weight yarn, and is 6 British pounds. Daniela recommends the Nightshift shawl from Andrea Mowry. Now Andrea has a whole series of these different patterns. I think there's some cowls and even sweaters that uses the same sort of technique where it's a slip stitch pattern, but she's got lots of colors going on here. So this is a good way to use variegated yarn. You can see some of the textures in there, like down here and here. So you're pairing it with another color and using all of this texture. That would be definitely very lovely. Oh, there's a good shot of it. So you can see it's creating larger stripes, but lots of lovely texture, and that texture is what you want when you're using variegated yarns. So it's an asymmetrical triangle shawl. You're starting here at this tip and increasing along this edge and decreasing along this one, and you're binding off on that edge, and that gives you that triangle asymmetrical shape. So one size, this one uses Aran weight yarn and is $8 US. Then we have Martina Behm's Easy, which is just a small one skein project. She has a couple of others. There's her Hitchhiker as well. And the way that's done, we're using short rows and binding off, like the shifting nature of that design would also work really well here. But we already had 15 patterns. I had to keep it at least a little small for this list. But this one, Also, like it's a bias triangle. I don't know what the final shape is, but it's garter stitch. So you've got the texture of garter stitch to break up the variegated yarn. You start in one corner and you knit along. I'm guessing over here, maybe you're starting in that corner until you've used about 50% of the yarn, and you can see where that dark color is there in the center. Let's see if I can make this bigger. Oh, there we go. And then you change direction and you add that second triangle. Now it's not seaming involved, like whatever method she uses, that it helps you do all of this seamlessly. So I like that it changes direction. You've got garter stitch, which is really good for using with variegated yarns. So it's one size, but definitely adaptable, because she does recommend you just keep going for that first triangle until you've used 50% of your yarn, and then you would stop and you would work this part. I think that's probably how it was done. Or here, you're starting here, I bet, and finishing here. That would be my guess, but I don't know. Uses fingering weight yarn, and it's just under €7. Let's look at sweaters and cardigans next. And this is where I feel like a lot of people start to lose it with their variegated yarns. You might start with your socks, and you're okay if that's like striping or pooling or flashing or whatever. And maybe for your shawls as well, because that's going to get wrapped around your neck and bunched up, so you're not going to see any of that going on. But when it comes to wearing a cardigan or a sweater, you're going to see every bit of that flashing and pooling and striping, which is fine if you want it, but not so fine if you really don't want it. So let's look at some patterns that use variegated yarns but do some things to help break that up. First of all is the Timely cardigan from Truly Myrtle. I think she has a few in this series where she's using a complementary color and just using stripes to break that up a little. So you can see here, this is worked from the top down, so it's a simple rolled stockinette collar, and then she's using 2-color stripes, so that variegated yarn and then a solid color as well. So you're just doing your top down raglan shaping, but you're doing 2 stripes or 2 rows in your variegated yarn and then 2 rows in your solid, and then alternating that, and that gives you, it breaks that. You can still see, like here it's almost a bit stripy within the colors a little, and then here you can see what would have happened without that striping. We've got like sort of this pooling area right here. That would have been so much more obvious if she hadn't broken that up with these second color stripes. So construction is very simple though. Finished with some twisted rib. I really like the deep hem here, and then twisted rib on the cuff and the button band on the front, but very simple construction. So this is definitely a good pattern for using variegated yarns, and it looks like a nice summer lightweight cardi that you could throw over a dress or something like that. So it comes in 15 sizes, uses fingering weight yarn, and is 16 New Zealand dollars. Now, Venom Wool Knits recommends this sweater, Nordic Nights by Jennifer Steingass, and I love her idea of using variegated yarn for the color work in a color work pattern, because you have just your base, like this black sort of speckly yarn is your background color, and you're using that most everywhere, and then you could use a variegated yarn for the pattern in this area. But because you're not seeing all of it, you're seeing just bits of it in this section here, and it's broken up with that background color, and also because you're stranding the colors across the back to create your stranded motif, then it can break up that variegated yarn as well. I'm not sure we're going to see any of that here in these patterns, but stranded knitting is a really good way to do that. So here's one. It's not variegated, but it looks like sort of an ombre kind of a yarn. This is 2 different colors here in this, so it could be some lightly variegated yarn there, but that's definitely a good idea. If you love color work and you love your variegated yarns, but you want to tone them down a little, color work patterns are a good way to do that. This one comes in 13 sizes, uses fingering weight yarn, and is $8 US. Jennifer recommends another Andrea pattern, her Nurtured sweater. Now this one uses slip stitch knitting, and the stitches are slipped. There you can really see all of the texture going on here. So back to that texture, really great way to highlight a variegated yarn. But stitches are slipped with the yarn held to the front, as far as I can tell from this. So you're getting a different feel for that variegated yarn. Like instead of slipping the stitches in the back, the combination of like the heads of these purl stitches and these slipped strands of yarn, you're adding more texture and variation to the yarn itself, so that can really highlight a yarn. I think this is looks similar to a pattern a stitch pattern that I swatched, so we're going to be looking at that in a future video. But this sort of slip stitch design where you're holding the yarn to the front, and we've got like, it looks like the heads of some stitches here, so some purl stitches on the front. That adds some movement and texture, which is a really nice way to use a variegated yarn. So this one for pattern construction, it is bottom up, knit in the round, raglan sleeve. You can see the decreased lines right there. Just a short cropped style, so it would knit up fairly quickly, and it is in an Aran weight, so it is a pretty quick knit. Comes in 9 sizes and it's $9 US. Alyssa recommended the Elton by Joji Locatelli. Now she says she uses 2 different hand-dyed variegated yarns. She didn't stripe them like the pattern. She did the dark color on top, lighter one on the bottom, but they both basically had the same color, so it worked really nice. But because this already has that sort of built-in striping, this is definitely one that you could consider. So the original pattern uses 2 different yarns. We've got like, I think, a fingering weight yarn here, and then in between for the stripes, I think it's like a lace weight, like either a mohair or an alpaca. So the 2 different yarn weights and the 2 different fibers give you this striping effect. But you could do the same with, use a variegated yarn, use that alpaca mohair for your stripes, and then instead of this solid yellow, use your variegated yarn there. You've got your stripes and you've got it paired with this mohair, so the fuzziness will also mute it as well. So that's a really good choice for knitting variegated yarn. So this is the cardigan version, but I believe there's a pullover version as well. This is knit top down, and it's a drop shoulder construction. You can see the sleeve, or the seam for the sleeve is way down here, dropped off the shoulder. So it starts up here. I'm guessing you cast on the back, and then you would knit the back to the armhole, and then pick up your stitches along that cast on edge and knit down to the armhole for the front, and then join and knit the body all together, and then come back and add your sleeves. So it uses fingering weight yarn and comes in 8 sizes and is $8 US. I was looking through and I really liked this one, the Pressed Flowers Cardigan by Amy Christoffers. Now there are lots of things in her Pressed Flowers series. There's hats, or a hat, there's a shawl, I think there's other things as well, but I think it's just a lovely design, and this is mosaic design. So mosaic knitting is a great way to use variegated yarn. Now, I'm not sure if that's what she used here or if it was some kind of a striping yarn, I don't know, but you can see we've got this solid gray color, and then for the mosaic, we get little blips of color in between, and then these little floral motifs. So this would be a good way to use a highly variegated yarn because it's really going to break up that color in there. And if you don't want to knit a cardigan, look at the others in this series and you could use a different pattern with the same exact motif. So this one is bottom up and it's seamless. So you're starting at the bottom, you're knitting this, and then knitting up to the armhole, then you would separate and do the front and the back, and then join. I'm not sure if it's 3 needle bind off or some way to join, and then you've got the sleeves to do and the button band. But definitely mosaic knitting is a good option, and I really like this. I think this is a very cute pattern. I might put this on my knitting list. This specific one comes in 8 sizes. It uses sport weight yarn and is $7 US. So those are the 15 patterns that I wanted to look at, and I'm sure there are so many more that we could have added to this list. If you have ideas, I would love to hear about them. We can always do another video in the future sharing more pattern ideas that would work really well with variegated yarn. So leave your recommendations down in a comment below. If you're looking for more inspiration, be sure to check out those comments because you guys always leave the best comments. I learn so much from you, and I love to share the things that you say as well because I just think that this is a great community and we always have so many interesting voices and things that we can hear, and I love to highlight them. So go ahead and leave your comments, go read those comments. If you want to talk more about variegated yarn, I'm going to put together a playlist of the videos in this series so you can click right there, and I'll see you in the next video.